Right. Well, hello and welcome everyone to the Black Response Cambridge Annual Funder Education Briefing. My name is Jeree Thomas. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm the program director of the Communities Transforming Policing Fund at Borealis Philanthropy. I'm based in Chesterfield, Virginia, on Monacan lands. In my role, I have the great honor of supporting 100 organizations across the country that are envisioning safety beyond policing and prisons. What I deeply appreciate about the Black Response is that they are meticulous in researching, documenting, and advocating for strong and well-resourced community-led safety alternatives. If you want to understand the different models of alternatives and what you should be considering and asking when deciding whether to resource a community-led safety model, you're in the right place. So welcome. So the goal of this conversation is for you to learn more about what it takes to develop and sustain an alternative. What are the exciting innovations, but also what are the real challenges? And what are the gaps that could be supported by philanthropy to help bridge and sustain resources and partnerships in this work? So when we talk about community-based alternatives to policing and incarceration, there's often such a strong focus on metrics of success that there is little room for trial and error and for innovation. Organizations often start with less funding than they need to implement an alternative, and then they lose funding if the program doesn't work perfectly. This happens despite the fact that every day in the United States, community members are experiencing police brutality. Some are dying at the hands of police or in jails. Our current system, which receives and has received billions of dollars in support over the past century, has tried reforms and has failed over and over again. And yet they receive grace, they receive support, and they often receive more resources when they fail. This grace and support is generally never extended to community-based alternatives, despite the fact that they are doing their work with only a small fraction of the resources and have not perpetuated anywhere near the magnitude of harm that our current institutions have caused to communities. We hope in this education briefing, you will share any hard questions you have, where you're getting stuck when it comes to supporting community-based alternatives. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the briefing. And if you'd like to voice a question during the Q&A, you can use the raise hand function on Zoom to do so. This briefing is truly an invitation. We have some absolutely brilliant panelists here today who have so much knowledge and experience to share that could really help you to shape your grant-making strategy and your thinking around the best resources for this work. The individuals and organizations that do this work are doing it out of a deep love and care for their communities. They want everyone to feel safe and have what they need to thrive. If you share this hope and intention, please support the Black Response, its partners, and other alternatives doing this critical work of making all of us more safe. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Minka to introduce herself and share remarks.
Oh boy, I didn't expect to go first. Thanks, Sherry. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Good. Now I'm going to see if I can see people while I talk. That's a tricky thing. I'm really appreciative about coming here today. I'm also appreciative about the technology, even though I don't feel like I always get enough information as to whether the communication is going well. So feel free to nod and give me signs if you're not understanding. Um, I'm Minga Clagett-Born, and I am part of the War Tax Resistance movement, and our official name is New England War Tax Resistance. I laugh with other people on the board because our acronym is NEUTR, and I always think of, oh, those poor animals. You know, we're not working with trying to spade any animals when we do neuter. We're a small alternative fund. We've been going on for a long time, since 1968. We work with many people of conscience. People give to our fund who are refusing to pay federal taxes because of their conscience, that they don't want to give money to the federal government, but they want to contribute to the public good. So we have this escrow account. People who want to stop paying into the federal taxes, which does wonderful things, like sometimes they provide road transportation, hospitals, help for the elderly, housing, but over 50% of the money that goes to the Pentagon, into the federal coffers, goes into the war machine, and it's for military. So we take people who want to see a different vision for the world, instead of one based on the gun and military might, to refund other projects that are going on. So we're clear that war as a system in this country is not just suicidal, it's ecocidal. It's got genocide wrapped inside its fabric, its skeleton. And there's been many war tax resistors, starting with our own Henry David Thoreau here, but also Bayard Rustin. Of course, Gandhi is famous. Muhammad Ali resisted the draft. I don't know what he did with his taxes, but the redirecting of the money comes to us, and we put it in an escrow fund account, and we use local investors to hold the money, and then once a year we will distribute the interest that's on our principal to local groups, and groups that are socially working on justice. We really prioritize a lot of LGBTQ communities, youth programs, and people of color, BIPOC folks. Is that a good enough introduction? Would you like more? Okay.
No, I think that's good. I'll go next. Hi everyone, my name is Stephanie. Thank you for joining us for the third annual Funder Education Briefing. So I'm here representing the Black Response. We are an abolitionist research and advocacy organization. We envision and work towards building a world free of carceral and harmful systems. And we seek to uplift Black, brown, and otherwise marginalized communities here in Cambridge, where we are, and everywhere, by working to unbundle, abolish policing, defunding the police to invest into communities, and support the building of alternatives to public safety and the development of community care initiatives. We conduct research to develop informed approaches for our advocacy. So advocacy is any activity that aims to influence decisions with political, economic, and social institutions. So we direct our advocacy efforts towards our community via our community education events. We direct our advocacy towards legislators via our reports and campaigns, and as well as funders and stakeholders like yourselves through this annual event. This year, we're building on previous research on alternatives. So during this briefing, we'll give an introduction to alternatives to lay the groundwork. We'll share some details on at least 4 models of alternatives. We'll share some stories from community responders and describe what we've learned about why alternatives fall apart and disappear. So following these videos, we'll have a panel ready to answer questions you may have. So let's begin. The first up is the video entitled, "What are alternatives?"
what are alternatives? After the murder of George Floyd in 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement began to call for alternatives to the police. We at the Black Response Cambridge have been trying to narrow down what is meant by alternatives to police. What is meant by alternatives to police? In order to answer this question, we need to answer the crucial issue: what do police do? In the 2021 New York Times article, How Do Police Spend Their Time?, we learned that police might spend their time directing traffic, responding to crime calls about property, medical incidents, violence, other social problems, doing proactive work, responding to non-criminal calls. So, what don't police do? Although police may break up a fight or arrest someone in the moment, police don't resolve conflicts. Police may collect guns and weapons through buyback programs or arrest someone who possesses or uses a gun, but they don't end gun violence. Police may drive a victim of domestic violence from one location to another, or arrest the perpetrator of violence if caught red-handed, but police don't prevent domestic violence or perform extractions. We bring up what police do and don't do because it is this process that allows us to find the gaps that alternatives might fill. What are alternatives? In order to understand what alternatives are, we found that there are some necessary questions to answer. They are: how are they legally structured or incorporated? In past funder education briefings, we presented on the three models we have explored: government-based alternatives, nonprofit-based alternatives, and autonomous community-based alternatives. What are they responding to? In our Landscape of Alternatives report, we presented that alternatives might respond to violence or crisis or the intersections of violence and crisis. This includes mental health, substance use, and material, including financial and legal aid crises, or youth, gang, guns, and domestic violence. What is the intervention of the alternative? Some organizations prioritize education, distribution, navigation, or facilitation. Some alternatives perform functions such as facilitating extractions in domestic violence cases, Mental Health First, Sacramento, California; navigate social services and family policing services, Cambridge Heart; disseminate Mutual Fund, Mutual Aid Medford and Somerville; facilitate conflict resolution, Unity Circles, and more. What is the temporal point of intervention? By temporal point of intervention, or what point in the crisis or violence, does the alternative intervene? We mean, does this alternative perform prevention work, immediate response, and/or aftercare? Does the alternative prevent violence, respond to mental health crises, provide care after a crisis? Who do they respond to? Do alternatives specialize in one or more marginalized groups, such as immigrants or formerly incarcerated people? Or does the alternative provide a general service to anyone who needs their care? So, what? We have come to find that the term alternative is a bit misleading. Although our use of the term alternative comes from the movement to create alternatives to police, we have a broader understanding of alternatives. First, we accept the Momentum Organization's framework. When there are justice movements, there are three approaches: change hearts and minds, reform institutions, or create alternatives. Second, this contemporary moment of communities creating alternatives is not new. There have been waves of people and movements throughout history when they have created alternatives. Many long-standing institutions today were alternatives. We recommend you read Kevin Hazard's American Sirens book on the Freedom House in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for a history of one alternative. Third, in order for us to create alternatives that endure, we need to study and learn from them.
Thank you, everybody, for watching this video. We have a quick question that we'll put in the chat for you. Take some time and look at that question and answer in the chat. And we will show our next video. Our next video is going to be looking deeper into what are the models of alternatives? So we learned a little bit about alternatives. Now we're going to talk about the different models of alternatives. And I just realized that I didn't introduce myself. I'm so sorry. My name is Virginia Cuello, and I am a TBR core team member, and I work very closely with the TBR team on figuring out how to implement alternatives. I'm also a co-owner of Karaya LLC. So with that, I'll leave you guys with the question in the chat and our next video. Thank you.
One of the models of alternatives. In order to answer this question, we have made 4 distinct categories of alternatives based on where they are institutionally housed. There are government-based, non-profit-based, community-based, and profit-based alternatives. In our research, we have come across a number of organizations that are considered alternatives. Some of these organizations include government-based, non-profit-based, or quasi-non-governmental organization community-based. For now, we will skip the for-profit alternatives. All of these alternatives are in operation. But what models do they use in their operations? In this video, we share 4 different models. They are the HUB model, crisis response models, violence interrupters models, each one teach one models. What is the HUB model? The HUB model, or situation table, is a type of alternative that facilitates resource distribution, as well as conflict and crisis resolution. The HUB model can be described as a partnership between organizations who reach out to one another on behalf of people in need of support. The HUB model uses resources offered by existing service providers. In order to develop a HUB, a facilitator is required. The facilitator brings service providers together and develops protocols and agreements for working together. Representatives from different service providers must sign and adhere to confidentiality agreements. Cases or clients can come from various sources. What is the crisis response model? A crisis response model services of a community by responding to specific needs, primarily behavioral health needs and emergencies. There are 2 types of crisis response models, mobile and stationary. However, a mobile crisis response program may have a range of services and clients depending on whether it is government-based, nonprofit-based, or community-based. For the mobile response, the team would need to receive a call. Then, a responder team would be dispatched to the location. The response team would de-escalate the immediate crisis and create a short-term safety plan on the spot. Lastly, the team would designate a follow-up aftercare team. In the mobile response type of model, you need to consider the source of calls and the infrastructure needed to receive calls. There are also stationary response models. In general, these programs operate as teams already out in the field or based at a specific location. Some models have teams facilitating mutual aid, such as handing out socks, toothpaste, or food, or providing care, such as first aid, foot, and dental care. Some community-based organizations, like Mental Health First and the Material Aid and Advocacy Program, MAAP, collaborate with other programs to train communities to facilitate services for members of their own communities. What is the violence interrupter model? They seek to interrupt trends in violence. There are a number of violence interruption approaches and initiatives. The violence interrupter model begins by asking which groups of community members use violence, where, when, why. So violence interrupter models may be designed to disrupt gang violence, youth violence, gun violence, domestic violence. Violence interruption can be designed to intervene at any point in the temporal line. Some prevention approaches include gun collection, community circles, and peacekeeping sessions. Immediate response initiatives include physically placing bodies between people committed to using violence, as well as conflict resolution and mutual aid. Getting people what they need when they need it is a powerful de-escalation tool. There is the Cure Violence, or ceasefire, a public health-centered approach that trains and deploys outreach workers from the neighborhoods with histories of violence to identify threats and intervene in conflicts. The communities that employ this model usually have a strong association with city governments or even the police directly. Domestic violence is often left out of the violence interruption framework. I assume this is because it is often fully autonomous organizations that facilitate violence interruption in domestic violence. I add it because organizations like Mothers Out Front and Mothers in Charge identify all violence as violence. Creative Interventions and other domestic violence and sexual assault prevention organizations employ prevention approaches and extraction techniques to prevent and interrupt cycles of violence. What is the Each One Teach One model? It is said that the phrase each one teach one is an African proverb that originated in the United States during slavery when Africans were denied education. When someone learned how to read or write, it became their responsibility to teach someone else. The idea is to spread knowledge for the betterment of your community. Examples of Each One Teach One alternatives are Ujima Medics, Mental Health First, Unity Circles, and Copwatch organizations. The Each One Teach One model has been embraced by the community and nonprofit-based organizations. It is easy to stand up but hard to financially sustain long-term with resources and infrastructure. Government-based alternatives have adopted elements of the Each One Teach One model, mostly by collaborating with community-based organizations or community resources like community centers and libraries. These are 4 models of alternatives. However, other models of alternatives can and have been developed through target population intervention. What are target population interventions? A target population intervention involves first identifying an issue among a population. An example might be a municipal government agency identifying youth violence as a community program, the population being youth and the issue being violence. The intervention requires a proposed solution. The best way to identify a proposed solution ought to be through a participatory action research process involving community members learning about the problem and possible solutions. In the case of youth violence, a possible issue could be low participation rate for year-round youth job programs. The intervention would need to address the low participation rate of youth jobs. The proposed intervention would be to seek to increase participation rate for year-round youth job programs. There would need to be intervention facilitators to identify actors to enact the intervention. Funders and organizations that lead these programs. 1. Allocate resources. 2. Have a clear and non-invasive monitoring and evaluation plan. And 3. They need to repeat the process until the take-up rates are high. If youth violence persists, a process needs to be facilitated with a new proposed solution. The Black Response would like to support organizations and communities that attempt to implement these models of alternatives. For more information on models of alternatives, contact General at theblackresponcecambridge.com.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that second video on models of alternatives. We're going to continue to gather knowledge on different approaches to alternatives, and we hope to continue to share different models with folks as they want to learn about them, fund them, and build them. All right, we're going to put up a poll right now. We really hope you can respond to it. While that's going up, I'll introduce the next video. So the poll is up. Which of the following have you heard of? So have you heard of the HUB model, crisis response model, violence interrupter model, Each One Teach One, or target intervention models? So please do respond to the poll. Okay, in the meantime, I'm gonna introduce the third video. So we've been really fortunate to speak with a number of different community responders and learn some stories about their work and hear about some of the challenges that they're reacting to. And so we've selected a few and put them in this video. So these are some stories from community responders and an introduction to a project that we're going to start on this fiscal year. So enjoy.
Nonprofit and community-led alternative public safety programs. We have sought to learn about the history of alternatives and community care organizations throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. We have sought to understand what these programs do, how they are structured, and what their challenges are. In this video, we dig into some stories we have gathered from community responders. Here, we will share 3 narrative accounts. These are anonymized accounts of some cases that Massachusetts-based community responders have received and answered. In order to share them, we need to acknowledge something that we have heard from community responders, that carceral entanglement complicates crisis response. By carceral entanglements, we mean all kinds of policing. We define policing as bureaucratic institutions permitted to use coercion and physical force against civilians for social order. Using this definition, we have expanded the institutions that might be considered police beyond patrol officers in municipal police departments. Instead, our understanding of policing institutions includes state police, court officers like bailiffs, school resource officers, public housing police, university police, social workers, family policing facilitated by the Department of Children and Families, and many more. During the participatory action research we conducted in Cambridge, MA, toward developing an alternative public safety program, we collected stories from community responders. In one case study, we found complex connections between factors like housing insecurity, domestic violence, job insecurity, the role of school resource officers, and more that influenced the crisis. So we decided to analyze more stories like this one, looking at the ways that policing figures and in search of strategies for disentangling carceral institutions from crisis response. Take Jane's case. Jane was a low-income mother of 3. She was a white woman with biracial children. Over the decades, Jane had become an infrequent user of addictive substances. Through hard work and lots of community support, she was able to get sober. However, she had lost her confidence and didn't smile very often. Her mental health had suffered, and so had her quality of life. Jane lived in public housing with her children. Her formerly incarcerated African-descended boyfriend had moved in as an unregistered tenant. She had been calling out of work a lot since he moved in. She called out because her children were getting into fights at school. She also called out when she landed in hospital with various broken bones. Her co-workers called community responders for an intervention. Jane was experiencing domestic violence. Many victims of domestic violence fear being evicted from their homes, especially if they live in government-subsidized housing. This can have knock-on effects like losing a support network, missing work and losing income, and losing or being separated from children. First, the community responders asked what she'd like as an outcome. She said, "I can't just leave him. He needs a place to live too. Otherwise, he will just follow me wherever I go." She needed her abuser to be securely housed. To free Jane from this unhealthy and physically harmful situation, we needed to help her boyfriend first. But how? This boyfriend has been convicted of a felony and was on probation. He was employed but was not earning nearly enough to pay market rent in the greater Boston area. He supplemented his formal employment with odd jobs and gig economy work, which wasn't enough to pay the market rate. His income was divided between probation fees, child support, transportation, and food, which didn't leave him any money to contribute to Jane's monthly rent to the housing authority. Jane was perpetually behind on her bills. She was already indebted to everyone around her, yet another reason she feared leaving him. She feared that leaving him equated to leaving her home. Leaving meant leaving the security of public housing and leaving all of the people in her network. She had a community full of resources in her neighborhood. She didn't want to leave. Through her story, we see that Jane's situation was entangled in carceral systems. Her partner was formerly incarcerated, meaning that there were probation officers and e-monitoring devices in her life. Jane herself had a history of incarceration, and the quarry impacted her employment prospects. With her children getting into fights at school, Jane also had a history of DCF involvement, what sociologist Dorothy Roberts calls family policing. The school that her children attended had school resource officers, SROs. Because they were going through a lot, the children were regularly punished for behavior infractions. The public housing authority she resided in has its own police division, so the family was under the surveillance of multiple wings of the carceral state. Let's look at Lydia's case. Lydia was a black woman and a survivor of domestic violence. She was able to settle in Massachusetts with her autistic child. Lydia's son, Miles, was beginning to act up in school. He didn't want to be there and sometimes left the school grounds. While wandering the streets during the school day, community members would call the police on him. There were times during the school day that he would need to be restrained, and they would call 911 for involuntary restraints on him. Eventually, the school confessed they didn't have the resources to care for him. They suggested he be enrolled in a residential facility for people with severe autism. Lydia refused and began looking into other options for him. Miles went months without going to school. When Miles skipped school or ended up in the hospital, Lydia would be called and have to leave her job. At some point, she was laid off and she started to fall into debt. The stress of the situation with her son, job insecurity, and the mounting bills began to take a toll on her. She found herself with an eating disorder and began losing a lot of weight. In Lydia's case, she had escaped a domestic violence situation. The police had been involved in that situation. Her former partner was the father of her child, which meant the state was involved in monitoring both Lydia and her former partner via child support. Lydia's son was disabled, which meant that there was an individualized education plan, IEP, for him. This meant that the school district monitored Lydia and Miles constantly via the social worker and caseworkers assigned to Miles' case. Miles regularly experienced having the police called on him and being restrained by police despite being an elementary school-age child. He had spent countless hours at hospitals being monitored by hospital police, and so had Lydia. Due to the situation with Miles, Lydia was also DCF involved and was being monitored by family police. In both previous cases, the person in crisis was a mother. In this next case, we look at a man named Benny. Benny was a formerly incarcerated sex worker. He got a job working at a nonprofit. Over time, he rose in the ranks until he was pretty high up. He loved his job. He got to coordinate outreach to sex workers. In many cases, he could help his friends from when he was in the streets. Over the course of several months, there were conflicts with senior management staff at his job. Benny was fired, but he refused to vacate the position. The senior management staff wanted to avoid calling the police on Benny. They did not want him to end up back in jail because he was out on parole. They were also worried that his behavior would continue and further harm his coworkers and maybe even the organization's reputation. Benny was out on parole, so calling the police on him would mean he would end up back in prison. The nonprofit had great relationships with sex workers because of Benny's work. If the organization called the police, it would lose credibility with the clients it sought to serve. Not holding Benny accountable would mean that the systems of accountability within the organization would be dismantled because they didn't apply to Benny, so why should they apply to anyone else? Benny's story was very complex. To respond to these complex and carceral entangled calls, community responders need a tool to help disentangle carceral elements from a crisis. Through the project we call the Nodal Analysis, we are developing a process that depicts links among actors to analyze their impacts on a social structure. We have 3 research questions. How do carceral systems show up in the crisis to which community responders are called? What do community responders currently do to disentangle various types of policing from crisis and crisis response? What challenges or gaps still need to be addressed? What does a community responder safety planning tool that accounts for how carceral entanglements or policing complicates crisis include? His research will contribute to the development of a new safety planning tool and training curriculum to facilitate the work of community responders. The safety planning tool will identify resources and processes that ensure safety while eliminating contact with carceral systems during crisis response. The training curriculum will include guidance on how the tool can be used in the context of crisis responders' work.
That's a bit of a cliffhanger. Welcome back. And thank you for watching this video. I promise we only have one more video after this.
They're entertaining. They're pretty good, Virginia.
I'm glad you like them. Thank you. We wanted to make this funder education briefing in a way that we can also share with others after the briefing. So this is new innovative idea of bringing videos to life. And we do have space later on for you to answer questions, to ask questions. So get all those notes of your questions out there as you watch the videos so we can answer them later on. We have one more poll question for you after watching this video. It's about understanding the value of the nodal analysis. So the first question is, what do you as a funder find valuable about it now that you've learned a little bit about it, or maybe you know about it from before? And what do you as a funder find Oh, sorry, the question is asked twice. You just have to answer once. But basically, whether you found the value of it. And that's our poll question. With that, I'm going to ask you take some time to answer that question. Our next video and our last video is one of the longest ones. And the reason for that is because we really believe it's important to explain this next part. We talked a little bit about what are alternatives, what are the models of alternatives, and we saw some stories, right? About how alternatives, about creating a toolkit that would support alternatives and responders in addressing some of the crises and conflicts. Now we're going to look a little bit about why do alternatives fall apart? Through history, we've seen that alternatives spring up and then they fall apart. So we tackle this in this next video.
Why do alternatives disappear? When alternatives fall apart, we find two types of factors: external and internal. External factors, things from outside of the organization that lead to its demise, include government interference, lack of financial resources, loss of trust, and poor alliances. A famous example of government interference in an alternative is the U.S. government's counterintelligence program that systematically attacked the Black Panthers and destroyed their community initiatives. Too many organizations and community initiatives sunset due to lack of material and financial resources. Loss of trust is a key reason why alternatives fail. People won't use them if they don't trust them. Funders lose confidence as well, which leads to many organizations and movements making alliances with harmful institutions, like the police or other harm-doing movement organizations, and this leads to their demise. Interference is an external factor. For example, government interference comes in the form of co-optation, absorption, and hyper-professionalization. Co-optation is taking over or appropriation of something for a new or different purpose. Government, legislators, and bureaucrats take community-developed innovations and bring them into an existing system, government bureaucracies. Hyper-professionalization isn't limited to governments. However, when governments are involved, they invoke liability as the rationale for requiring licensing and over-professionalizing community-based innovations. Hyper-professionalization occurs in two ways: when governments disregard lived experience and community knowledge, bringing in consultants or assuming they know better, or when people who develop the ideas are excluded from the table when the program is being implemented. The program drifts too far from the reach of marginalized community members. Organizations and movements merging into alliances can cause splinters within movements and among coalitions. For example, when some domestic violence movement leaders decided to align with police to address the immediate threats of domestic violence, there were splinters in the movement. Those pro-carceral leaders collaborated with policing institutions to incarcerate those who use violence, work toward harsher sentences, and police protection for victims. Most importantly, this strategy doesn't address the root causes of domestic violence, the socialization and indoctrination into violence. Many people with lived experience left those organizations. But what about internal factors? Internal factors are the most significant reason alternatives fall apart. We've identified 3 elements of internal factors that lead to the demise of alternatives: lack of sound organizational structure, defective communication infrastructure, and poor systems of accountability. Poor organizational structure is a big problem for alternatives. They rarely have the resources to revisit and revise the structure. In many cases, they do not have an organizational chart to illustrate it. Unfortunately, innovative organizational structures can be a problem. This can be a problem because there are times when innovative structures do not have the legs to stand under pressure. At DBR, we are committed to collecting examples of good, mediocre, and bad systems to create a resource guide for communities seeking to create alternatives. There are several parts of the organizational structures that need to be examined. We begin with the staffing structure. In several organizations, including our own, there were those with no job description. There were people whose job description was beautifully worded but didn't reflect their responsibilities at all. There were people whose responsibilities were completely outside of the organization's scope and mission. Organizations need to evaluate their staffing structure annually. The division and distribution of power needs to be scrutinized. Who has power and who doesn't? We recommend that each organization define power, create an organizational staff chart, audit its resources, and then identify where power is concentrated, where it is absent, and where things are working well and why. Alternatives need to think about revenue and sustainability. Does the organization have a revenue and sustainability plan? Is the plan viable and sustainable? Money is scary. We spoke with several organizations that have clear principles rooted in collectivism, anti-imperialism, or anti-capitalism, but they hadn't identified how they would collect money. We are also mindful of the strings that come with different types of money. However, these organizations are not sustainable. Funders need to grant organizations money and resources to develop a revenue and sustainability plan. TBR has begun to collect revenue generation models to share with alternatives. Communication and lack of transparency are other internal issues that cause the demise of alternatives. Communication is a broad umbrella term for sharing knowledge inside and outside of an organization. 3 elements of communication warrant a closer look: interpersonal communication, guidelines for internal versus external communications, and organizational communication, these systems, mechanisms, and tools. Interpersonal communication refers to the ways that staff share knowledge and affection within an organization. It can also be considered part of the organization's culture. To create a sound interpersonal communication culture within the organization, we recommend creating, communicating, and practicing guidelines. At TBR, for example, we have a guideline about our onboarding process that includes discussing communication preferences. We co-develop a table that is shared with everyone about communication needs. As we develop our guidelines, we send monthly newsletters with the updates, and we keep the guidelines in an internal TBR handbook. A cause of conflict within organizations can be in the guidelines for internal versus external communications. This is a problem of communication and transparency. Consider the accountability question. How will the guidelines get enforced? What is the sequence of events? What are the consequences? TBR has begun reviewing our internal communication systems. We have done a preliminary audit of our guidelines for internal and external communications. This is having an impact on how we onboard people. In this process, we have had to revise our definitions. How do we define membership? What is an organizational partner? What is the difference in how we communicate with the various types of members and partners? At TBR, we found that certain people held knowledge about how and which people to communicate with, but it wasn't written down. So, new people found it hard to navigate the systems, voiced a lack of autonomy, and experienced uneven power distributions. In undergoing this internal process, we have found it beneficial and recommend that others do it too. Perhaps the most important internal factor that can harm alternatives is accountability. By accountability, we mean understanding you're part of the whole operation and taking responsibility for whatever happens to your part in the whole. The best example is a sports team. Each player has a position. They understand their position to the overall objective. The team develops a game plan. They practice plays and techniques for communication. Failure to do your part has clear consequences for the individual and the team. This is accountability. Accountability tends to be individualized. However, we have come to see that accountability works best when it is considered as a system. A system is a set of things working together as parts of an interconnecting network. A system works best when everyone understands it. So for accountability systems to work, everyone needs to understand the overall objective. We have learned that accountability works best when integrated into the organization's infrastructure as part of its communication systems and guidelines. For these accountability systems to work, they need to be created, understood, and agreed upon by the individuals that make up the organization. This ensures an understanding of the systems and fosters a sense of belonging. When communication is not transparent and honest, the systems of accountability can fall apart. Relationality has also been figured into accountability systems flailing. This can happen when someone has a relationship, such as romantic partnership, friendship, or familial tied to someone whose responsibility is to maintain accountability systems. If or when allowances are made because of relationships, the accountability system can signal exceptions. When there are exceptions, those who know the exceptions are harder to hold accountable. The people without those relationships can rightly lose trust in the system. What tends to happen is that accountability does become individualized. This can harm alternatives. Funders should consider making resources available for alternatives to develop their accountability systems, for opportunities to evaluate and reinforce their accountability systems, and to share their accountability systems with other alternatives. Alternatives might develop their accountability systems by hiring an external consultant like Shira Hassan at Just Practice, or hiring an individual to carry out the process from within, or both. Alternatives might evaluate and reinforce their accountability systems by going on retreats to review and onboard their team, and they might develop more mechanisms for making the accountability system more transparent and accessible to everyone. Finally, funders ought to consider funding conferences and convenings with panels and workshops on accountability, structure, and communication systems, or making resources available to collect, curate, and distribute research on accountability systems. At TBR, we want to replace carceral systems with alternatives. Alternative institutions need to be carefully designed, field-tested, and evaluated. To do that, we need to be honest about alternatives and about ourselves. If we do not critically examine alternatives by researching them thoroughly, the ones we build and support will fall apart and disappear. So, at the Black Response, we are doing our part by collecting stories and materials on strategies for evading external factors, as well as models of organizational structures, communication, and accountability for the development of a resource guide. Public and private funding for alternatives is in short supply relative to the need. We are asking you, our funders, to do your part and commit to supporting alternatives for the long haul.
All right, these are the videos. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to collecting your questions. I'll pass to you, Jeree, to get us started.
All right. Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thank you for those incredible videos. As I was watching the last one, I thought how applicable those videos are, not only to alternatives, but to every organization. And so really appreciating y'all for sharing that. Those are really important lessons and recommendations. So I am now going to introduce our panelist, who will be available to, well, I have a bunch of questions, but also available to answer any questions that you all have in the audience. So please do feel free to either drop them in the chat or use the raise hand function on Zoom if you do have those questions. So I'm going to just quickly and briefly introduce everyone. For the panelists, please correct me if I mispronounce or misspeak on anything. So first we have Ann Jenks, who is a union and community organizer. She organized for the community development of Oakland's Mobile Assistance Community Responders of Oakland, also known as MACRO, to create a community crisis team to respond to low-level 911 calls instead of police. And now she's working on a number of things, including assisting municipalities and engaging community and other stakeholders in the development and implementation of alternative response models for emergency calls. So thanks for joining us, Ann. Barbara Ortiz currently works as a community responder and responder team manager for Cambridge HEART, which stands for Holistic Emergency Alternative Response Team. Barbara is also a member of the TBR team. Then we have Earl Miller. Earl currently serves as the Director of Community Support at Wildflower Alliance and is a former Director of Community Responders for Equity, Safety, and Service, formerly known as CRESS. Stephanie Grand has recently completed a PhD in sociology at Goldsmiths University of London. Stephanie is the Program Function Manager and Senior Researcher for Community Service Cares and serves as a Senior Researcher for the Black Response Cambridge. Virginia Cuello is a member of, and you will correct me on this, Carajas LLC. She has created a network of support liaisons between marginalized communities like immigrants and undocumented folks, and the resources and information they need to thrive. Virginia is the secretary of TBR's core team. So those are our incredible, incredible panelists. And I want to thank our wonderful folks for dropping their full bios on the chat so that you can learn more about their work. And so I'm going to just pause to see if there are any questions in the chat or amongst this group. But if not, I will start on my many, many questions. All right. All right. Well, I'll let the questions continue to percolate, and I will start on mine. This first question is for Barbara. Barbara, could you talk about what types of questions that funders should ask when they're looking at how to support alternatives or looking to support alternatives?
Thank you, Jerry. I think, there are a lot of typical questions, I think, that come from funders around demographics, around population served, things like that, which are important. But also, I think, to ask the orgs what would be most supportive at this point in time for funding, and also what would be most supportive for the future. As it was mentioned before, ideas and innovations are really underfunded. So money is important to make an idea come to life. At my work at Heart, we do apply to grants and we submit proposals and things like that. The very fantastic grant writing team, which are volunteers. We can't afford our own grant writers, so we rely heavily on volunteers for our work to come to fruition. There were times in the community where, let's say, for example, recently we had a lot of folks who were immigrants to the area and needed certain material needs, just even material. And let's say we need to order like 50 children's boots or something like that. Some of the funding is so specific to a certain thing that we were like, okay, how can we get this, but then, and give it immediately to the community because there's a snowstorm coming next week. But then the way things are worded in a grant, would make, okay, we have to submit an amendment, so we have to wait this waiting period. So it made it really hard to actually provide the service and support the families as they needed. So I would say unrestricted funds is one way, and unrestricted does not mean unmonitored, because we always have to create reports and describe our work and give, all of the information on what we've been doing, but it is the most flexible and it helps us address immediate needs. And most importantly, or just as important, I would say, is money for hiring responders. We are really short-staffed, and it's not because we don't want to hire other people, it's purely because of funding. And the need is much greater than the amount of people we have on deck. Sometimes we have to consider, okay, we have to cap our number of community requests because we won't be able to properly support or be with someone because we don't have enough staff power, people power to do it. So that is I would say the foundation is enough money to hire folks with lived experience, but just folks, period. It really impacts our capacity to respond and the availability to respond, because the people who are on the task will get burnt out so much faster. And then the quality of care, we don't want to compromise that. So that's really important to have those two things: funding for staff, funding for training, funding and unrestricted funding. So once we have funding, we can bring it to the community quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So the next question that I had was for Earl, and was wondering, Earl, if you could share with us why not focus on pressuring some of the government-based programs that are acting as alternatives to do what they're being asked to do, right? So we know that as was just shared by Barbara, funding is a huge issue, right? So if you have a program that's funded by the government, you'd hope that there could be some sustainability there. So why not sort of pressure the government to do that and to create true alternatives to police?
I think it's important to say that 3 years ago, I would have had a very different answer for this question, and kind of my experience doing the work has shifted. I think there's a couple reasons. I think that there's a reality that the way that bureaucracies are established makes them really hard to shift, and creating new government bodies, I think there's this idea that they will be embraced, but you have to think about the way that the other institutions in government are going to think about that, which is that the amount of money coming in has not changed, and now there's a new competitor for the budget. And so you're forced into these kind of adversarial spaces from the very day you start. You are competing for applicants. You are competing for space. You are competing for attention, both from elected officials, appointed officials, and the community, who all are trying to live their lives. And frankly, we have to acknowledge that the crisis we're experiencing right now is as much a crisis of faith in government as it is in any particular body. So for folks experiencing it, and my experience doing the work was, okay, you're not the police, but you're paid by the same people as the police. And the people in charge of it are the same people as the people in charge of the police. And if this goes poorly, by the way, who are you going to call? And so it's really hard to earn trust when kind of the roots are really wrapped up into the existing structures in a way that, even if it isn't in actuality a co-optation, my experience was the folks we were working with were in the midst of such extreme trauma that the idea that they were going to go on our website and read our mission statement and read through the way that we were oriented was nil. Those things were for folks who weren't actually using our resources. I also think that we have seen that privatization in these things can be effective. Ambulance services are a wonderful example of that. Some communities continue to have that come out of municipalities because they think that that's the most effective. And some have made the decision that actually having a third party come in that doesn't have the same restrictions as government. So an example of working in government, what you're not able to do is give people money. You're not allowed to, someone shows up and they're hungry, you can't feed them. You aren't able to move as swiftly to address the needs of the folks in front of you as their needs warrant. And I think when we talk about the infrastructure of public safety, we're talking about a very old system. We're talking about a system that doesn't shift easily. And the leadership, I've learned to think, I'm sorry, I'm a reformed government employee, so I will try not to go too long. But I've learned that the folks who are in power now generally are about 30 years into their career. That's the average it takes someone to climb in a bureaucracy, which means that even as we're talking about reform, we're talking about that with folks who were educated, who were trained, who were hired during the most carceral period of our history, which was the most carceral period in the history of the world. And even if you show them data that shows that if incarceration worked, we would have solved every social ill. Nobody has ever done more of it than us. It is hard to pull back from the roots of where you start with things, right? I am guilty of this too. Despite trying to be the most open-minded I can be, when things are tense, what I go back to is what I learned early in my career. And where that fails me is where that training wasn't sufficient. And that is true of government infrastructure. The last piece I'll say is that I think a thing that happened nationally in this moment was that communities had this mass influx of funding. They had ARPA money, which government is not accustomed to getting, $1 billion in a week. And so it was easy to say we will do all of these big things because the money's around. It literally was, if you went outside and said, hey, I got $1 million problem, somebody was trying to get rid of $1 million that day. It was coming out. And now, we are living in the last 2 weeks of ARPA money. We are living in the very last days of that funding. And what is going to happen in this budget year for alternative programs is that now they're going to be put in competition with your school budget. They're going to be put into competition with the senior center, which were in the budget before the pandemic, before George Floyd passed away or was murdered. And they are going to lose that battle. They're going to overwhelmingly lose that battle. Because what kind of fair argument is it to say, hey, we'd like to do this alternative, or we would like to educate the children in the community? I think it's a really important piece to think about how the private market has the ability to innovate in this space where it is a functional reality that government is going to be less available to fund these things. Just on a personal note, I come to this work not as an educated, as someone with a PhD. I come to this as someone who grew up in foster care and institutions, was homeless in the city I work in these days. And the importance of the private market, a person like me doesn't ever make it to this role without community investment. And my career is a real reflection of that. The Wildflower Alliance, where I work now, no other agency would have hired me. I was a guy with a GED who couldn't get a job at the Dunkin' Donuts up the street from me. But the investment that they were able to make in me allowed me to be someone in my community that was impactful. And I think that's the other piece where the private market matters. Government is not designed to hire people who do not have lengthy and comprehensive educations. They are not designed to reward lived experience. And one of the things that's become really clear to me is that I was able to do the work in spaces that my contemporaries throughout the country were concerned about. I was, at the time of me working in Amherst, the only Black man running a department of this type in a government agency in the country. And now there is none. And so I also think the private market has the ability to incentivize that the folks who, this starts with the murder of a Black man on TV. Not that other people are not impacted, but the way that particularly Black men have been excluded from this is something that I think is baked into the fabric of government, to inherently see Black men as dangerous or less capable of empathy or understanding or compassion. And that is really a space that, private funders are able to incentivize those sorts of connections. And as much as I think I've had a meaningful part in the role, in the work has been as equally transformative of my life and changing the trajectory of my family. And that's the value of being able to think nimbly and swiftly, and why I do not think that simply asking the government to change its funding strategies is effective these days. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Earl. I really appreciate it. So many important points to note, including that the ARPA funding is drying up, right? Including that very important services to our community are going to be put in competition with each other. And I think the other thing to name is, well, let's talk about why policing, right? Policing in jails isn't a part of that conversation. And I think I know there are a number of organizations across the country that are really trying to think of how do we remove and shift resources from those services that we know have most of the resources in a lot of localities. I wanted to note there's a question in the chat from Kareem. I believe, Kareem, if you want to voice it, feel free. If not, I'm happy to voice it for our panelists. The question is, I was thinking a lot about entanglements to policing and how police alternative groups are technically entangled with state surveillance and supervision, IRS, financial surveillance, state regulations on the use of funds, etc. Have police alternative groups outsourced their services to non-state recognized groups / community leaders?
Is it okay if I take a swing at this one?
Yeah.
So what I would say is, I think there's been an effort. I think there has been an effort to, so for me, when the work I did, we made a point of, we received funding from the state that had to be spent 50% in the community. And we made a point of not spending that money with traditionally existing well-funded structures. So we funded the Wildflower Alliance. We funded a motivational interviewing instructor to teach people in the community the same things we were learning. But what happens is, the police and police unions are institutions that are very, very well designed and very, very well supported to protect their own interests. And so I think when we talk about this thing about like, oh, alternatives, like I think alternative is a terrible idea. I think saying alternative, because at the end of the day, alternative, I think, leaves room for this to become replicative of policing. What I thought about was this idea of kind of a completely new structure, as different from policing as firefighting is, as radically different. And the way that the structure is set up is that everything is judged in comparison to policing structures. Everything is judged right next to the police. And so, like, what sort of, if I want to do a healing circle, what is the data point I take back to the city to demonstrate the efficacy? If an example of something we did, we had a gentleman with dementia who was nearing the end of his life, was very lonely. We would spend 10 hours a week with him, just hearing him. He was really intent on telling his life story. And for me, it felt like this was a man who deserved to be honored in his last days. What is the data point for that? I do not believe that he was going to go rob someone if we didn't go meet with him. And in the same breath, it felt like, as much as public safety, like this structural idea of it, was that dignity was a part of public safety, and that allowing people to live out the end of their days was as much about public safety as standing in front of the CVS to make sure people didn't shoplift, that it was as significant. And for the people who were funding the thing, all they could think of was really in terms of cop shows, not actually in terms of policing. Their sense of what public safety was that we were chasing criminals all day. And this was in a place that had one of the lowest crime rates in the state. So if I was chasing crime, I would not have found much of it. There was not much to find. And still, people's assumptions. And so when you talk about supporting alternatives, I think you're talking about a radical, and I mean root cause radical. That's what I'm saying when I mean radical. And we still have not unpacked the racism of the war on crack, of the lack of public health approach to the 90s, the drug epidemics that occurred, the HIV epidemic. And so people still think very black and white about what resources are considered public safety. So I think they've tried, I've tried, but then someone's going to say, well, did that stop someone from breaking the law? And, until there's some way to predict what crimes are going to happen, you're always going to be chasing the 8 ball. I would say the surveillance and supervision pieces, I think people are trying to stay away from that, but you should know that the kind of tide pulls you back to policing. The tide, very much the kind of day-to-day pieces of it are, we started going to the schools to meet with kids who were in isolation rooms, which I don't think people know how much that happens in this state. And that swiftly shifted to, hey, will you tell us if they act violent? Well, who defines violence? Who defines what is something to be fearful of? My folks weren't afraid, but the guys with guns were pretty concerned about a lot of things. And that disconnect, I never really ended that conversation. So I think, I don't know what the answer to that is yet. I think we're still so early in the experiment that the places where that conversation has really come up, it has been abruptly ended, either by the ending of the program for some reason, or the increasing of the police budget to a place where that alternative is no longer able to compete. And I'm saying that in a world where almost every alternative is outfunded by 10 times. And sometimes even at that 10 times, they'll increase it to 15. And like, what am I going to do? I have 10 people, you have 100. I'm never going to be able to cover enough ground so that it shows on a piece of paper that I'm as efficient as you are. I hope that was close to an answer.
That was fabulous. Kareem, the thing that I'm constantly shocked at the level of entanglements in places that I hadn't even thought about entanglements. Many 911 dispatch offices they screen names to see if you have any outstanding warrants. And I only discovered that because I was talking to some dispatchers, and I think Cahoots said, well, the first thing we had to do was say, if it's a Cahoots call, don't screen for warrants. And I was like, they're screening everybody else for warrants because you called 911 because your house was on fire? I mean, how is that a good idea? And I mean, so the entanglement, and it never really stops. A lot of conversations that I'm seeing right now are with kind of the new wave of criminalization of unhoused communities, where you have an alternative group, and the city, of course, is like, well, if we've got these folks and they deal with homeless folks a lot, then they should definitely be involved in our militarized eviction of an unhoused community, right? But the conversations for those programs, even if they're very well-meaning, is if they're involved, they can mitigate some of the violence. They can help people pack their stuff up before they're kicked out. They can at least be a calmer voice than the cop who's screaming at somebody who's already in a mental health crisis. So I mean, I'm not good at judging, but it's like really hard for me to say, no, don't go, right? Just leave it to the cops because it's such a bad scene. You don't want anything to do with it, when I understand their impulse to go, right? But so it's not only many different factors that none of us have even like totally created lists of all of the different ways, but also there's a ongoing encroachment that is always happening.
Sorry, real quick, I just want to also add, this is actually pretty safe work. 3 weeks ago, I would have been able to tell you that nobody working in one of these roles in any of those 4 alternatives had died because of their work in the world. That actually changed. A violence interrupter in Washington, D.C. was killed by the police. So like it is a matter of, this work is overwhelmingly safe. By the nature of not having a gun, this is just a helpful, we are easier to insure, for liability. Not bringing a weapon into things is much more affordable, not buying ammo or weapons. And the response from people, I think, part of the burden that this work has is that we have to answer every hypothetical situation folks have, and they're often like action movies. Most of our work is quiet. It's sitting with someone in distress and being empathetic enough to hear them through to the conclusion. And that may mean hearing feelings that they're having for the first time. But I think if you think of this work as like we're kicking in the door and we're like, we don't have a gun, calm down, like that's not at all what it is. It is an attempt to institutionalize and manifest love in meaningful ways in communities, because we are aware from decades of research that the only meaningful movement for people is community that is engaging and willing to meet them where they are. Sorry.
Please do not apologize. Thank you both for sharing that response. I want to see if there's any other responses or any
Yeah,
other.
I have a response to this particular question. I have found, and Virginia, you actually received the calls. So I found that the police alternatives or various like municipal departments call organizations like ours when they actually want to solve a problem. But I mean, Virginia, you can say more.
I mean, sorry, it's just, this is what happens. And it's just very interesting to be in that position that I'm sure all of us, like, I know Earl, you've been in this position. I don't even have to ask you, and so are you, Barbara, but it's the position of, because you do this work in the community and people know you, there could be somebody that works for the government already, and they actually want to help and they know they can't do anything. So then they call you and they're like, hey, can you help me with that? And what I end up doing, and I'm just gonna be like very blunt and honest. I once had a call from somebody asking me to get a job for, oh, I have this person, they're undocumented, can you get them a job? And I was like, well, first let me educate you on what you're trying to ask me to do. And then let me check in with the person and talk to them to see what is, what is it that they need? What resources do I have that they can, that I can point them towards? But what you're asking me to do is, hey, I don't want to break the law. Can you break it for me? Basically. So
That's pretty insane.
and things like that happen. And so you're doing the sort of education back and forth, but there are folks within that want to help, but they're not in a position, they can't, but they also need to understand what is it that it looks like, what is it that, how is it that you can organize those things, and why can I go talk to that person, is because we've already gained that trust, right? They know that I will not call anybody else first, which I think is a little bit too much to call somebody else and give that person's information. I think that's where it starts with the making sure that you keep that confidentiality. So that's the first thing, like being confidentiality with that person, keeping it there with you and that person, giving them all of the truth and all of the real, right, things, and then making sure that they make their own decision, that it is onto them, the decision that they make. And I think that's the most important thing, is to listen and to protect the person's decision, and that they can make, you give them all the options, but then they can make their own decision.
Thank you. Thank you for that additional context. And I think I just really want to appreciate what you're saying, which is that folks call y'all when they actually want to address a need in the community. And I think that speaks to, and I want to loop back to the conversation that we were having where, and I believe maybe Barbara, you sort of started us on this track of talking about how oftentimes the way funding can be restricted, it doesn't allow folks to be responsive, right, to specifically the needs of the community, which is what y'all really are focusing on. And so related to that, because I think this kind of also connects to the questions around metrics that we often hear. And if you could talk about sort of what are the things that funders should be looking for when they're evaluating funding an alternative. Oh, and if you're speaking, I think you're on mute.
I'm gonna have that tattooed backwards on my forehead. So I actually, what you just posted about the Borealis Movement Defined Learning Project can probably answer this question better than I can. One of the things I think that would be tremendously helpful for funders is to have people with some level of knowledge about these types of programs that are involved. So if that's not the folks that are actually going to be looking at them, you got to like get some of us out for some beers for a little informal conversation about things. And several people for different, I mean, I have opinions, but like I would say be checking around a little bit, because I do see, especially the Better Resource programs have they've put real effort into kind of how they tell that story. I was recently listening to a presentation from a program where he was asked about how they determine how do they use data to determine where there's need. And he said, well, we look at police stop data to identify areas to go. Now, stop data is literally which cars police pull over. And I still to this day cannot explain to you how police stop data will help you determine anything about responding to crisis, except to the extent that the police stops are often a crisis. I mean, it was insane, but it sounded okay if you didn't know what stop data was and you weren't really familiar with crisis. And everybody in the room kind of nodded at him. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense. So, I think that's really important. And it becomes more important because, as other people have mentioned, the co-optation of language and co-optation of models. The other event I was at recently was the city of Cambridge was doing a presentation about their new program. And you would have thought that Stephanie was talking, except if you listened for a while, there wasn't a lot of content below the surface, right? But they're alleging that they've got it all worked out and it's all okay now. So I think that that's really important. The community engagement, community oversight, and community transparency around the model. And this is something I've again kind of seen situations where it sounds okay. You've got to be in there and talk to some of the people who are engaged and find out kind of who they are and how they got engaged, rather than just accepting, that you're ticking a box. Yes, there's a community advisory board. Well, what are they doing? Can I see their last round of recommendations? If they've never made a recommendation, well, that's weird. I recently saw a community advisory board that literally is mainly stakeholders, like somebody from the fire department. And I was like, I think we have different definitions of a community advisory board. But when it's a chart saying, do you have this? They've got it. So what's observable, I'd say, in terms of the transparency and the oversight and the community engagement and how deep it is. Planning, you've got to accept evolution of the program based on learning and also the obstacles, because you're trying to keep going, even as obstacles are created over and over again. And data. I have seen some programs that are like, yeah, no, we don't have any data. And I'm like, that makes no sense. Like, there's data available. There's the number of people you're engaging with, at what times I mean, come on. So some kind of data. And I would say you have to expect to see repeated obstacles. In Oakland, the police killed an unhoused person who was asleep, and there was a gun nearby. And we started doing this about 2 years before George Floyd's murder. So it's been about 6 years now. And for the first year and a half, 2 years, we found cahoots up in Eugene, Oregon. We brought them down. And, and for the first 2 years, I was wandering around saying, why has nobody done this? Cahoots has been doing it for 20 years. Why have no communities done this? Now I know exactly why communities haven't done it, because it's not like there's an obstacle and you overcome the obstacle and then you move on. They take literally the same obstacle and they just reconstitute it in front of you again. So you think you just got the city council vote to pass, and then it turns out you have to have the same city council vote again. The way I view it is that the status quo is kind of like a virus that's constantly mutating for its own survival. And it's just going to keep doing that over and over again. So,
and I know we are coming right up to our time. And so I just wanted to take a pause because I believe we have a poll that we wanted to share with folks. Because we want to really continue this conversation. As y'all can tell, that this is a rich conversation, and folks are doing really critical work. And so I really hope that folks will stay engaged. I believe this poll will also be shared with all the registrants for today about how folks can support the Black Response Cambridge and continue to really build on this incredible work. And then I don't know, Stephanie or Virginia, if y'all would like to close this out.
Yeah, thank you so much for attending, and thank you, Jeree, and all of the panelists. Minga, we're really grateful that we're able to have this space and share some of this work. We are making ourselves available to anybody who wants to continue having this conversation. We're happy to share what we've learned. We're collecting tools and resources for folks, and we want to keep sharing them. So we are here and we want to keep doing this work with all of you. So thank you for coming today, and we look forward to hearing from you.
And thank you to our panelists for being here.
Yes. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just want to say,